Hey guys, it's Jack with Jackson Lean. We're continuing our equipment series today, going over some basic back machines, lever, linkage systems, cams, etc. Let's get to it. So let's start this off by covering one of the more common types of resistance for back machines, which is the lever row. Already by using a machine, you're going to be typically having more effective back training compared to dumbbells or barbells. Also, that's not always the case, but for the most part, like with chest presses, let's cover just the basic mechanics of a lever here real quick. When we are, this distance here we're looking for is the distance from the axis of rotation to the load and the line of force, which is gravity acting straight down. So when that distance is at its longest horizontally here, it's called the maximum moment arm, and that's where we're gonna feel the most load in the motion. On this machine, this one's a pretty well-designed lever row because as I'm in this more lengthened position here, where my back is more lengthened, you can see that that distance is pretty horizontal and it's at its max. And as I pull back, I get weaker here, but this load now is coming more perpendicular here, more vertical, right on top of that axis of rotation. And right here, there's actually no load at all. It actually starts to fall that way a little bit. So I'm obviously outside of my active range of motion, but right here, maximum load where I'm lengthened, and as I get a little more short and I get a little weaker, this load is starting to let off because it's moving closer to that axis of rotation. So the basic mechanics of a lever once again. Another note on most machines, but specifically back machines, something to look for is when the movement works from the bottom, right below our body there, so the pivot point is down here, versus a pivot that moves from above us, like on this hammer low row. So on this one, just to illustrate, as I pull, this pivot is now above me, and I'll cover in a future video why I would choose certain types of positioning for that for different muscle groups. I tend to lean towards more of the overhead pivot. Okay, and just so you guys can see real quick, another more simple lever that might load a little more shortened position. Now, I think hammer strength gets a little bit of a bad rep. Everyone's like, oh, it hits so hard in the bottom, and it does, but remember, you're also disproportionately, a little bit weaker there. So it hits there, but if you actually get the mechanics of it, it's not completely terrible, but it is more shortened than something like that first row. So, we'd start the motion up here. As I come down, right about there, that load is, from the pivot point here to from the axis rotation to the load and straight down, that's where that distance is maximized. And I'm still like, kind of mid position here. I'm not fully stretched, but I'm also not fully short. Now, if I were to lean forward now, all of a sudden, this shortened position is now more at that max point. So you can alter based on your body position where that's loading as well. So when I coach this, I have people lean just a little bit. But that's beside the point. So as you come down now it starts to actually let off a little bit as that swings up and around and becomes more towards being in line with that pivot point. And this is where I'm a little bit weaker. So I would call, if you're executing this, how I would execute it, more of like a mid load. But if you're here, you're definitely going to feel in the short position a little more load hitting there. So just you guys have some different visuals on the pivots being above or below you, and then what the actual levers are working. We need to make sure that with the back training, it's a little bit easier to hit something like a chest more optimally with just like a dumbbell because we are in the lengthened position. Mechanically, that's how it works. With the back, as we get weaker with gravity, we're trying to pull up against it, we're weaker here. So we typically want machines to help provide more effective training for your back. The next resistance type I want to cover for back machines is a linkage system, which I really do like for back pieces. The reason for that is like with the chest press, it acts a little bit more like a cam, a little bit less like a lever, because a linkage system is still a series of levers. So if we're looking at the mechanics of it, it still acts like a lever, just a little modified. So we have this axis of rotation and the load with the gravity going straight down. So just so you guys can see how this one works here, when I'm in this lengthened position with my lat being lengthened, that distance horizontally from load to axis of rotation is at its maximum length. So it's maximum or longest moment arm. And as I pull back and I get a little bit weaker, you see that load come towards this axis of rotation, and I can feel the noticeable let off. So as far as mechanics are concerned, this one loads that lengthened position pretty well, which will help aid in back growth compared to especially something like a dumbbell row. there's also something called the lift ratio, just to point that out again for you guys, the distance that the load moves versus the distance that my body segment moves. So on this one here, let's call this 2 feet from wrist to shoulder. As I pull 2 feet back with my hand, that load horizontally does not move 2 feet, which just theoretically some people say it might feel a little bit better, a little bit more natural. If anything, it just helps allow the engineers to design a lever that fits based on the arc of the body and the arc of the motion without being subject to the same exact constraints as a traditional lever, which however long it is, and when if your hand's there and the weight's there, it moves in the same ratio. So that lift ratio on these linkage systems does tend to come into play just as far as how smooth that movement feels. If you guys come across this Nautilus row in your gym, highly recommend using it. It's a pretty darn good piece as far as mechanics are concerned. So I also want to cover a cable row, since I know a lot of people do a cable row in a gym versus like a cable chest press. The thing to remember with cables is that they're going to provide a constant resistance. There's no levers acting on them, and there's no cam shapes changing how much is being pulled where. It's just going to be basically wherever the pulley is redirecting, that line of force is where I'm going to be acting against. So it's actually pretty easy because you can just see it, right? So on a cable here, that line is coming basically right through my stomach right now. And the one thing I don't love about cables is that they work linearly. They don't work rotary. Now they do ultimately with lots of systems of pulleys, but we're just talking a row. This is a straight line. So at some point, I need to typically adjust my body position to get into position I need to whether it be activated muscles, reduce pain, etc., because of the constant line of resistance. But at least you can predict it. Now, some people say, like, well, why is this cable machine I can do 300-pound stack and the other one I can only do 200? And that's going to be dictated based on the number of pulleys, which I'll do a more in-depth video on. But basically, the number of pulleys will influence how much load is being taken off of the end user. Okay, so you have to provide less force or to move more load, for example. The thing to remember here versus like this Nautilus row, which I showed a little bit earlier, is you have to once again adjust. Okay, now I'm going to be more lengthened here, and I'm going to have the same resistance as I would back here. So it's maybe better than a shortened row that hits all the way back here for some applications, where something like this Nautilus row, a good cam row, or a good linkage row, it tends to adjust for you a little bit better, creating more natural movement pattern, so you don't have to be adjusting your body around it because they took that into account with the resistance type. So cable row, neither good nor bad. Just remember, it's a constant resistance that you're going to have to be working against. The final type of resistance I want to cover for this back video is going to be a cam resistance. So we've covered the simple pulley, which is basically a lower version of a cam. A cam is just like an upgraded pulley that just redirects force a little bit better for the most part. This is the Biomaster CXI seated row, one of my favorite upper back machines of all time. So you guys can see how a cam works. And this right here, remember, we still have to account for, okay, my line of force that I'm creating, the axis of rotation, and the line of resistance from the machine, okay? So at the bottom here, they're pretty much, they're pretty close together, which means that there's not a ton of resistance right there. So my lengthened position, I have a little load, not quite as much as I would like. And as you pull back on a cam, you need to once again look for, okay, the line of pull the user is creating, the axis of rotation, and the line of resistance from the machine. This starts to become a little bit further away here. So I feel a little bit of hit because I need to do a lot of pulling back here to move this a little bit. So it's not ideal. It's not as bad as if these were flipped and the resistance was all the way out here. That would make it a little bit harsher of a resistance curve, but still ultimately better than, a lot of levers. So I hope you guys learned some things about the mechanics of back machines. It makes almost more of a difference than any other body part to have a good machine. For the most part, I like linkage systems and cams, especially, and I'll cover this in a future video, overhead pivots, primarily for lat training and some upper back training. But levers, they can be good or bad. And even the ones that are more lengthy, you just gotta pay attention to where those pivots are coming from. If you guys got any questions on anything, want me to evaluate a machine you want to use in the gym or you're looking at purchasing, drop a comment, send me a message. I'm happy to help. We'll make sure we keep these videos rolling.